Science Night. Please stand by.
Welcome back to the Science Night podcast. My name is James, and with me, as always, is Steffi.
Hey.
And Jason.
Hello.
Tonight, we're talking about underground infernos, solar sausage, and poison control. In the second half, we're talking to Carolyn Dugas, who will teach us about sustainable foraging. But first, the news. So I think we can all get behind the idea that burning coal to generate power is helping to drive climate change, right? That doesn't seem too unintuitive. However, the idea that climate change is causing more coal to burn seems a little less, intuitive to me at least. That doesn't mean that it's not true. So in an article from High Country News, Austin Gaffney covers the effort to learn why more coal seams are burning underground, how they're affecting wildfire season, and if climate change is responsible. And I thought this particular article was interesting because I grew up 20 minutes away from a very famous coal seam fire in Centralia, Pennsylvania. That fire has been burning for 60 years. And then I was even more shocked to find out that that is 100th of the length of time that the longest burning coal seam fire has been going for 6,000 years in Australia. Climate change and coal linked, those two great tastes that taste great together, and B, the ground is on fire everywhere, apparently. So that's something to think about. So what do we think about these underground infernos?
This is pretty fascinating, just to think that we could have these underground fires. But then you step back for a second, you think, well, we're talking about the crust of the earth. But if we're talking about the mantle of the earth, the whole thing's on fire. So it's really not that weird to think that there's something on fire below the surface of the earth. But
True.
This close to the surface of the earth is, I think, what is jarring. And the fact that you could have a fire burning underground spreading great distances and not see anything that would tip you off to that is also kind of frightening. So the story that we read had an opening scene where a fella's truck got swallowed by the earth because it was on fire underneath. That's apocalyptical, right?
Yeah, it's wild.
Apocalyptic is probably the word. Apocalyptical just sounds bleh, like I'm from Kansas.
It sounds like a Fallout exercise bike. The apocalyptical.
Oh, yes.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, it was wild how in the winter you can find hints of where these underground coal seam fires are by looking at where snow is melting.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the summer, the smell of sulfur. And you get these burning sinkholes. Just I can't even imagine coming upon one of these and seeing it like they did in the opening of the story.
Right.
The other thing I found was fascinating is they're trying to actually get a larger data set to see how prevalent these coal seam fires are, and if we're seeing an increase due to the increased temperatures and the increased amount of wildfires that can spark these coal seam fires, that then coal seam fires can ignite wildfires. So you get into this negative feedback loop. And so they're trying to get the data set, the scientific data evidence to prove that. And so a lot of times they were flying planes overhead to document where these coal seam fires are. You can do infrared imaging, and they weren't able to document as many until they started flying drones closer to the surface. Suddenly, in areas where planes weren't seeing any coal seam fires, now they're seeing so many more because they have the diagnostics, the measurement tools to actually locate them.
The thing that really jumped out to me, because I was thinking what is there, maybe 5 more coal seam fires or something, and it doesn't really matter necessarily what the number increases because it's increasing at a rate of about 1,400% over the past 2 decades. That is a little bit alarming. And I think what you said, Steffi, is absolutely correct, is this is just creating a feedback loop at this point where coal seam fires are starting wildfires that start coal seam fires. And this is just kind of piggybacking around all these areas of Montana. So this article is talking about Montana, which has a very large and close to the surface coal seam that is around large portions of the state.
So what I thought was most fascinating about this story, going to Montana here, was that locals just treat these as nuisances on their properties and just monitor them themselves until they get to a certain size, and then they have to call in authorities. But they dig a fire line around it. They just kind of keep an eye on it. You know, it got me thinking, like, I do something similar when I put out, you know, or when I let the fire in my fire pit burn out, right? Like, I make sure that, you know, there's smoldering coals there, and I make sure that they're not spreading, but like, I'm not actively worried about it. If it gets big, I would start to freak out. I can't imagine, though, this is all above ground. You know, I have sand in the bottom of the fire pit to make sure that it doesn't actually get underground and spread, because there are tree roots and all that kind of stuff. Like, the last thing I want is for the tree next to the house to go up in flames because of a fire pit 100 yards from the house or whatever. That's extreme. I don't have that big of a yard, but 100 feet from the house is probably better. But, you know, that's the last thing I want. And to think that they're just monitoring these larger scale fire pits that are underground was kind of interesting to me.
Well, and that's the wild thing about coal seam fires, is that there's not a lot you can do to put them out. Like, I'll talk again about the Centralia fire. They tried flooding the mine shafts just with like huge amounts of water. They tried flooding them under pressure to try to like force the water into the area. They've tried like drenching the ground from above, and it is still going strong 60 years because of the way that like you can douse the like edge that's exposed, but the fire just kind of keeps like smoldering down below, so that when the heat that it's generating dries the coal out above, it just lights up again. And like, this article is focusing on wildfires, but I think the other thing that we have to think about is that when, like, once the area of coal that's actively burning goes away, you have sinkholes, you have some pretty noxious fumes. So again, Centralia, the reason that they kind of abandoned the town, and you can see some pretty like ghostly images of the 1960s version of this town and today, it wasn't necessarily because of a fire issue. It was because of the fumes. Like, the air quality was so poor that they had to abandon, and sinkholes were pretty prevalent.
Right. So this article talked about how the smell of sulfur is really strong, and that's about the only clue that you have that there's a coal seam fire going on nearby, unless it's in the wintertime, in which case, as Steffi mentioned, you can see, you know, areas of melting snow.
Or in the case of the opening story, your tires start melting while you're driving to put out the fire.
That was terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, I'm used to having tires do all sorts of things because I drive on Indianapolis roads, which are among the worst in the country. But that, I've never had them melt.
You know, it's like the Indy 500. You got to get that friction up, right? To get those tight turns.
That's right. You know, they say at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is the only 2.5 mile stretch of road in the entire city of Indianapolis that doesn't have potholes.
Do we have anything else to say about coal fires and how we didn't start them?
I just think this is fascinating. I didn't even know that was happening, and the extent and for how long. Like 6,000 years, a coal seam fire in Australia? That's wild. And that how little data that we had. So I thought it was fascinating that Montana is actually, you know, the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation is actually getting the data set, and the scientists were like watching YouTube videos for hours on how to fly drones so that they could get this data that didn't exist before. It's awesome. Climate change, the more we look into the cycles, the more it's all connected and just going haywire.
Sure. I mean, that's going to be inspiring a lot of people to make a lot of different decisions, isn't that? Coming up, hopefully.
I saw a story in CNN actually that said that most Americans think that still think that climate change is not coming for them.
Define most. I mean, over 50% is technically most. What are we dealing with? We're dealing with like 80? Because that's bad.
My guess is that it's the folks where I live and where Steffi lives that are not concerned about climate change because they think that they're insulated, but they're not. We're not.
Especially if they got a coal seam nearby. Over the summer, Images compiled by NASA from the data sent from the new space telescope has wowed the science community and the general public. These incredible images have allowed scientists like previous guest Dr. Lacey Brock to learn about distant planets, stars, even galaxies. And as the years go on, a whole new crop of scientists will probably point back to this moment as the one that inspired them to pursue a career in science. And here's a fun story, guys. I gotta tell you, there's a life change coming for me. Just the other day, I saw this like super incredible image shared by French scientist Etienne Klein that showed the Proxima Centauri star. It was like the most exquisite, some might even say delicious detail I've ever seen. And I just think like being able to see a star in this detail, it's really inspired me to go into a different field of maybe like astronomy, astrophysics, even that plasma stuff that Steffi's always talking about. But it's really interesting when you can see this detail and it just inspires you to just, what's up?
That was sausage. It's chorizo.
I don't know, maybe that's different language, but they said Proxima Centauri.
The closest chorizo to our sun.
Hold on. You're telling me that this French guy went on Beyonce's internet and did a hoax with chorizo sausage on the space telescope? This is why we get bad name, isn't it?
For sure.
So yeah, let's talk about this little French faux pas that I'm sure blew up a lot more than Etienne Klein suspected would happen.
I wonder if the backlash came because he didn't put up a French sausage, but instead he put up chorizo. Do you think that like if it had been French, it would have been okay?
What is a French sausage? I can't even.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure that out too.
I'm sure there are some. France, if you can give us the hookup of some French sausage, we'll compare it to chorizo.
I would say like the color profile of chorizo is more like the sun images. So,
Did the fat blobs look like plasma to you? Did it look like plasma eruptions?
So, if you just like kind of glance at the image where you see like the different variations in like orange to yellow to white, that kind of looks like sunspots that we see where you have, plasma swirling around in this amazing star and breaking field lines, reconnecting, shooting out flares. You kind of get a hint of it in chorizo.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So I saw the image knowing it was fake. I really wish I would have seen the image not knowing it was chorizo first to see if it was like a what color is the dress situation. Like, am I ever going to be able to see a star that is not chorizo from now on?
All I can think of is, man, huevos rancheros. Like, that's
so delicious.
I know. That's what I'm saying. It looks so good.
To the scientists' credit, like they immediately came out like, no, this is fake. I'm sorry. Please, this is fake. Don't believe it. And the best thing that has come out of all of this is the many, many memes where they replace a star or the moon with this slice of chorizo. It has been great.
I haven't seen those.
Oh, man. You got to go to his Twitter. It is like... just imagine like a beautiful moonlit beach, but with chorizo hanging above it.
Yeah.
Or you have like the three sons of Tatooine, but they're all chorizos. Yeah.
When the moon hits the sky like a big pizza pie, that's chorizo, right? Something like that.
And in all things, the internet remains undefeated.
I just want to point out that both of you just stared at me when I was singing and you're like, and then we moved on. Nothing.
I mean, it's a good thing that you're not like depending on making a name for yourself on something that is only your voice.
That's good. That's a good point.
Scientists on Twitter, like, can they make jokes? When they make jokes, are they supposed to put a disclaimer? With so much misinformation out there.
Right. So we have a responsibility to not confuse the public, right? We have that responsibility. But at the same time, like we should be authentic people.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
if you're a jokester, it's okay. But I do think that maybe you need to have some kind of disclaimer or an immediate like, hey, this was just a joke.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess I didn't look at how quickly the "This is Chorizo" post came, but it was pretty close to each other. And the reporting is reporting it as the prank, not as like this amazing image is
Right.
available to you. But I think you're right. Like, we have a lot of scientific hoaxes that permeate through science history and are just like cannon fodder for all of the misinformation folks on YouTube. I could see where if you just like superimpose a skeleton that to look twice as large as you, the giants community that is all over the place is going to steal that and be like, here's an actual scientist that has proof and he's hiding it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or Coyote
Well,
Peterson.
I mean, I had this on my personal like social media once. My social media is this like family dog community scientists like meld. So I was like, I'm not microwaving food. That's gross. Microwaves are for plasmas because I microwave plasmas for a living. Like that's the science that I do. And so I got so many messages from like friends and family and like people that know me. They're like, wait, are you saying it's not safe to microwave food? Is that what I'm like? No, I meant it to be a joke. Like when I see a microwave, I'm like, I need to use this at work for plasma, not for food. Cause that's when, yes. So I even learned I have to be careful about that.
You know, I'm totally with you. Every Thanksgiving, before my wife's grandmother passed away, I was always the one who was charged with carving the turkey. And she would come in and she would say, where did you learn to do that? And every time I would say, well, this is just an occupational hazard. It's what I do for a living. What do you mean? Right. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, like I carve things up for a living. Like that's my job. I don't understand. Never mind. But we're not going to talk about it. Right. But like, I would never use a scalpel to carve a turkey.
Sure.
Right.
But I would never use a kitchen knife to do a dissection. So it's kind of the same thing here, right? Like just use your stovetop, Steffi. Don't use a microwave to make your food. Use a microwave to make your plasma.
Yeah.
By the way, how powerful is that microwave, right? Imagine making a hot pocket in that microwave.
You'd have to hit the stop button real fast.
It would vaporize. I mean, it's like 1,000 times stronger than your microwave at home.
What's the size
At least
difference?
The size of a person versus
okay. So you can't mix it
size of
up.
my hand.
Got it. You can't throw the popcorn in there and hit it and like the whole lab smells like burnt popcorn forever.
No.
Brings back a vision from the movie Real Genius, right? Where the laser made the popcorn in the house and just filled the entire house with popcorn. With a montage of people playing in the popcorn and Tears for Fears, Everybody Wants to Rule the World playing. It's an iconic image from my childhood.
I think that's the one they filmed at General Atomics. Because there's like a couple scenes.
Callback.
In that building where I'm like, oh, that's the cafeteria over there.
Oh my goodness. We're talking about chorizo. We're talking about popcorn. We're talking about microwaves. I'm getting so hungry right now. It's a good thing that I just found like this clump of mushrooms that I've been snacking on outside you've been chatting about all these things, and I gotta tell you, they really hit the spot. But
hold on, you ate those without considering what they were?
Well, they look good. I mean, if the Mario games have taught me anything, these are the best mushrooms to have. But for some reason, my tongue's a little itchy, and like, you can see sounds, right? Like that's a thing that we've always been. Steffi, why are you melting?
No,
that's what I was going to ask you.
No, did you take a picture of it?
Yeah, no, it was like the Mario mushroom, the red with the white dots. That's fine, right? I mean, that little plumber man seems to be fine.
No. You've done something horribly wrong.
Oh no! If only there was a place we could turn to tell me what kind of danger I'm in.
There is. We're going to Facebook now. We're heading over there to Poison's Help Emergency Identification for Mushrooms and Plants.
Oh, yeah. Wait, James, they said it was psilocybin.
Oh, that's fine. It'll make the rest of the recording much more interesting.
Okay, this group is fascinating, though. Especially, if humans or your dog or cat eat a suspicious mushroom or a plant, this online community is amazing because worldwide, they have experts that will look at your images and identify pretty quickly what it is. I'm just in awe of this group.
Yeah, well, especially like compared to the alternative that we would normally think of, which is the poison control hotline, which the story from the article that we're going to link talks about like a concerned mother calling and saying that their toddler has ingested these mushrooms and them saying, oh, email it to this email and we'll get back to you in a couple hours. Like, I am a parent and I don't think I would be okay with hearing like, just sit tight. It'll probably be fine, right?
Yeah, we need immediate information, or as close to immediate information as a parent, to make us feel better about sort of what's happening. Mm-hmm. This kind of community is fantastic because it's almost real-time identification for you. It reminds me a lot of the Twitter account that I actually follow about brown recluse spiders. I live in an area of the country where there are lots of them. It's called Recluse or Not, right? And people just post pictures of these spiders. Is this a brown recluse? Nope, it's not. Okay, it's such and such. Okay, good. Right? I've been bitten by a brown recluse twice now. It's not a lot of fun, but I've lived my entire life in an area where they are. And so, we just do our best to make sure that we don't provide them with the kinds of spaces that they want to live in. Or if we have those spaces, that if we're entering those spaces, we're doing it slowly.
That's the spider's realm.
That's right. We are announcing our arrival to Aragog, if you will.
Here we go. And you walk in with intentionality and knee-high boots.
That's correct.
What I think is great about this group is not only how, it's a network of experts around the world and they can identify it fast, but oftentimes or sometimes people are pretty familiar with the apps that can identify plants or fungi. And you really, really want to be absolute sure when it's something that may be poisonous. So getting human eyes on that are experts is like key in these situations.
Right.
So then you can give the information, the species to poison control or the medical experts that know how to treat it.
Right. Because if you're using something like iNaturalist, for instance, that's going to be like algorithm driven rather than actually having people. And in the case of this Facebook group, it was started by mycologists and experts in the field. And now it's also a lot of community members who are able to like look at past experiences and everything. Because we talked about the stories of just like toddlers stumbling upon them or pets eating them. But since the beginning of the pandemic, foraging has gotten really popular. And I can imagine that this Facebook group has gotten incredibly popular as well, as they're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have put this in this fettuccine Alfredo I made from the woods. So I can see where this site will continue to get popular as time goes on, especially now they got the Science Night bump.
That's right. What we should point out, though, which I think is the most interesting and probably best aspect of this Facebook community, is that there is a system of moderators, right? Mm-hmm. There is a collection of moderators, and only moderators are allowed to answer initially. What is this? And they're allowed to identify. And then once that has been done, they will allow anyone to comment.
Right.
This is important because in a situation like social media where every voice can be heard, it is sometimes hard to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? What is the good information? What is the not as good information? And in this case, the moderators are credentialed. They are mycologists. They are experts in fungi. Having them be able to voice their opinion before non-experts or people without the same credentials can voice their opinions means that the information is probably more trustworthy at the outset than it would be if this was just a Twitter hive mind kind of approach.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you still get the benefit of it being decentralized. So you don't have like your local poison control center might have a single person that could potentially be able to identify this. And hopefully they're working that day or can be reached. Whereas this, you have the benefit of a large network over a larger area. So you can get a hold of somebody. I think maybe a lot of different Facebook groups should take note from this and have only moderators be able to talk at first.
I think it's also important too that people who are using the group actually look at the rules and make sure you're posting in an actual emergency situation. It's not just like, oh my gosh, I saw a mushroom in my yard. What is this mushroom?
Sure.
No, that's not an emergency. There's another Facebook group for that. Someone, especially for fungi, you have to ingest it. So you have to actively see someone or an animal eat it so that you know it's an emergency, because if a patient is presenting with symptoms that may be similar to, toxicity from fungi, but you don't know that it ate the mushroom, you could be doing misdiagnosis. So it's really important to actually have evidence too.
Sure.
Yeah, because the same toxicity syndromes of certain mushrooms could also mimic just an anaphylactic response to an allergy of the other things that you had in your wild mushroom fettuccine alfredo. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's going to be different treatments. Now that we've learned what not to do when foraging, let's go to my conversation with Carolyn Dugas to learn more about how to forage safely and sustainably. We'll have that segment in just a moment, but first, a message from another podcast that I think you will enjoy.
Nature, we're part of it. Animals, we're one of them. What can we learn from other species? How can our lives be better by reconnecting with nature? And why does it matter at all? That's what Wild Connection, the podcast, is all about. Every week, we bring you authors, filmmakers, scientists, and conservationists whose work is revealing why being connected to nature and wildlife matters. You can find us where you get your podcasts, including iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. We're hosted by Podbean, so you can find us there too. And you can keep up with us on Twitter at WildConnectPod.
Welcome back to the Science Night podcast. Tonight, we have a fantastic forager for you to learn some more things about what's growing around your house. We are here with Carolyn Dugas. Carolyn, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me, James. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you bringing me this cup. It looks like there's like moss in it or something. I saw on your website how you were really into moss smoothies. So what am I going to be experiencing when I take a sip of this?
Waves of euphoria washing over your brain. How's it going down?
It's a little chunkier than I'd like. I guess vegetal. I think vegetal is one of those things they give as a tasting note. I'm not gonna lie, it tastes a lot like moss, but that's okay. Edible and flavorful are two different ends of the same coin, I guess. So let's talk about foraging. I am not much of a forager. I'm one of those people who want to be a forager so bad. And then the idea of like, I'm gonna die if I do this without knowing anything. So tell me about how you got into foraging.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really common feeling as you enter into foraging. I was the same way. I think I had this like terrible fear of eating wild plants for the first 20 years of my life. Didn't eat a single thing besides dandelion leaves. And kind of my first entry into this world is I attended a plant walk with Abby Artemisia, who later became my teacher. And it like busted open my mind. It was so nice to have a knowledgeable person who I really trusted and felt comfortable guiding me into the world of foraging and wild foods.
Now, I assume like you could learn everything you would need to know from a combination of books and YouTube videos, and podcasts are a great resource for identifying visual media, but podcasts as well. But how important is it for you to have a person that you can walk into the woods with?
I would say it's, extremely important. I was the kind of person who I love books. I love book reading. I was like, I'm going to get all the books. I'm going to teach myself how to forage. I'm going to do this. And I got the books, and I could not tell, alternate from opposite leaves, which is like the most basic botany plant. And it just like, I wasn't able to trust myself because I didn't have, any cultural background for working with wild plants. But as soon as I worked with a person who regularly foraged, it was like a green light to go ahead and like taste the stuff. And I didn't feel like, I had to have years of research on my own to understand them.
I feel like foraging is one of those things, like I said, it seems like a lower barrier to entry, but if you want to eat something that is good, maybe there's a little more work than you're expecting. So what do you say to the person like me who picks out something that people say is edible, and it is just a cup of moss that I've been told is going to be a transformative experience, and just kind of lets the hobby go at that point? What's your advice to somebody like that?
Just like there's the whole spectrum of flavor in like grocery store foods, that spectrum is mirrored in wild foods. Mm-hmm. So, there's the boiled Brussels sprouts of the wild food world, and there's also like the fanciest flavorings you'll find at only the most gourmet restaurants that people really pay top dollar for, that only grow wild. So there's a whole spectrum. So if you had a bad experience, that's very common. Don't worry. There is a whole world of flavor out there for you.
And, talking about foraging and kind of, using grocery stores as an analogy or a simile, we're a science podcast, not an English podcast, like or as. Anyway. So, it's really interesting because I think as like a modern Western culture, we're pretty divorced from where our food comes from. And that's one of the things that I am trying to get a little better at. And when I think of foraging, I just think of, it's forcing you to eat seasonally. It's forcing you to eat extremely locally, and it's really forcing you to kind of know where your food comes from at a very personal level, to avoid poisoning. So I really am interested in the things that you're doing and kind of like reaching out into the community to get more people into this and just have them be aware of the things that's all around them. So could you talk a little bit about what you are doing to raise awareness in your community?
Sure. So last month I taught a free class at the library called Eat Your Weeds. And I taught folks about tasty, easy to identify, relatively safe weeds to harvest that are just growing in their gardens. A lot of people, myself included, when they first encountered foraging, like thought that you had to go into like the deep, dark woods to hunt down the rarest plant. But in reality, some of our, most delicious and nutritious plants are growing right outside our door. It's hard to beat that level of accessibility. Even in cities, there's a ton of edible weeds around, although this plays on your point of, you have to know where you're harvesting. You have to know what kind of stuff, if there's salts on the street, like what kind of chemicals might have been dumped there. So you do have to be mindful of that. But I like to focus on weeds that grow right around us because it's very empowering. Like we've lived and worked and been around these plants, all our lives. And it's like almost taking the little like plant blinders off your eyes and suddenly you can see the diversity around you.
Absolutely. And, I don't think anyone is going to complain about doing something with the weeds that they're probably going to be pulling out of the ground anyway. And it's really interesting that you say, you had the only thing you had experienced before is dandelion. So that makes sense. It's everywhere, in, at least in the Northeast. I come from a very Pennsylvania Dutch area, so we definitely ate the heck out of dandelion. leaves, not so much the root. That was something that I actually had to come to learn, that you could eat up the roots too. So that's really interesting.
Did you ever have them with like hot bacon dressing, which is a Pennsylvania Dutch specialty?
That was like, that is the taste of spring for me, is dandelion greens with some kind of warm dressing. Man, now you're making me a little bit homesick, but that's the great thing about dandelions. They're everywhere. I always look outside and I'm like, why would people want to kill these? There's an entire market around killing dandelions, but man, you can eat every part of it. Except, the seeds don't taste great, but my daughter puts the seed heads in her mouth all the time, and it's
for the adventurous eaters.
Yeah. You talked about how you can get a lot of the things just outside your yard, but a lot of people will eventually go out into the woods, or at least into a less populated area. What are the things that people should think about when they're doing that might not seem as obvious? Obviously, you want to make sure you're on places where you're allowed to be and you're being safe just being away from people, but what are some things that you might not think about?
In terms of like safety, or more like the ethics of harvesting?
I think both. I think being safe in an area where you might not know so much about, and then also making sure that you are kind of foraging the right way. So
I would say, to address the first point, that you really should be foraging in areas that you do know. Foraging is a very kind of relationship-based art. I would say, like, having a relationship with the land, having a relationship with the plants. And so, if you don't know an area, you probably shouldn't be harvesting there. You should be, you can identify an area as somewhere you might want to harvest, and you should return throughout the seasons and see how the land changes, see which animals are eating the plants, get a feel, for the ecology in the system. And as for kind of harvesting principles, it's really important to develop your relationship with the plant. So learn its life cycle, learn when it's okay to harvest it, learn how much you can harvest without harming the plant. It's hard to talk about foraging without, talking about ramps, which have kind of become the poster child for New England or Northeast foraging. And they are grossly over harvested and like frequently irresponsibly harvested because they do have a 7-year growth cycle. And so when you see them in the store and the roots have been picked and the root bulb is there in the store, that's killed a plant that takes 7 years to regenerate itself to get to that point. So it's really important to do research on, not just identification. Identification is just the first step, but learn healthy and sustainable harvesting practices for each plant and mushroom you gather.
Yeah, that seems like such an important piece. If your goal is to go out and forage so that you feel more connected to your land and more connected to your food, it would be a bad thing to just go in and kind of clear cut an area because you really want to have some fiddleheads with dinner tonight. So yeah, I think that is a very well put point. I want to talk about a specific thing that you have a nice looking recipe for, and I'm sure it's great, but it is just the scourge of my existence. And that is invasive Japanese knotweed. So I have so much of it in my backyard right now. It is like 6 feet tall. It grows 2 inches a day, it seems like, if we get any kind of sun. But it is something that some people can get joy from. So let's talk about like foraging and invasives, and what are some of the things that you need to be especially careful for if you're kind of harvesting things that may be invasive for the region that you're in? Is there any other precautions you need to take?
Sure, that's a great question. Probably the biggest one is to be aware that, as you mentioned with dandelion, there can be whole industries based on killing these plants. So I've had friends who had knotweed patches that drove them to the brink of insanity, and they were out there with little syringes of Roundup stabbing each little individual knotweed shoot to make it die. And you need to be really careful that, you're not harvesting in an area that's recently been sprayed with like glyphosate, because you don't want to eat that. That's not, it's not going to do you any good. Kind of a good tip for knotweed specifically is in areas that are frequently tended where people are trying to get rid of it, they'll often, they'll cut it down and they'll clear out the stalks. So if you're looking for like an undisturbed area to harvest, look for a place that has lots of the old dead stalks on the ground. Mm-hmm. And you can tell there's probably, not someone who's fussing over how to destroy it, at least actively.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to the point where I'm using pesticides. I'm trying to do it without, poisoning my water table, but I'm right on the brink.
Hopefully we can pull you back.
I dislike the idea of using any kind of herbicide, so I'm probably not going to get there. But I did call the extension service, and they're like, well, you could move, I guess, if you don't want to use any kind of herbicide. So that's where we're at right now. But, I'm very close to the Connecticut River, so don't want to get anything in that water. So I want to talk more about your online presence, because I've been watching some of your videos on YouTube and on your social medias, and they're a lot of fun. They're very informative, but they're also a lot of fun. So how do you come up with the ideas for the songs, for the music videos, and just your general recommendation videos and the things that you're doing on social media?
Oh gosh, yeah,
I know that's a very big question.
A lot going on there.
Yeah.
I guess I'll start with the songs. So I work closely with my creative partner, Will, who is a wonderful songwriter. And I guess I really needed an outlet for like all this like love for foraging and wild plants and mushrooms that is inside me. And so I kind of talk constantly to the folks around me about these. And eventually Will was like, well, I think we should write a song. And so he'll like get out his little guitar and, write up the song, and I'll sing it, share it with the world. Yeah, I just hope that making things more fun makes the like education easier to swallow, because I think that like foraging should be fun. I've had some really great teachers, and I've also had some teachers who kind of just were monotone and like only the facts. And it was so hard, like even though I'm personally invested in this subject, it was so hard to stay engaged. And so I really think that, bringing in other media can help folks really get excited about this. And another person who's doing, great things in this area is the Black Forager.
I love her. We want to get her on the podcast so bad, but she is so busy. But standing invitation to any forager that's going out there, because again, it's something that I'm really interested in, and really kind of interested in getting the information out there. And I think to your point about having people engage with it in a new way is really something we're passionate about here at the podcast. With science communication of all kinds, it's really important to use the talents that you have, even if they aren't the traditional methods of conveying the information, to get it out there. Because you're right, when it's fun and then it's accidentally educational on the back end, the information gets out there and people come back. So I think that's just as important. So the last thing that I want to ask you before I release you back into the forest is, how can people follow you, and how can people keep up with the things that you are doing, with the things that you are foraging?
The best way to keep up with me is to join my newsletter. I've been taking a little break from social media, but I always announce stuff on the newsletter, upcoming classes, new recipes on the sites, new songs. I announce that to the newsletter first. So if you go to my website, freshandforaged.com with a D, foraged with a D, and sign up there, I would love to meet you in my virtual newsletter space.
Thank you so much. We will have links to all of the things that you're doing on our website. Carolyn, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, James.
You have come to the end of another episode, but don't worry, we've got lots of new things coming your way, including more special episodes from our trip to Gen Con a few weeks ago. So be sure to follow us on social media. If you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at James_Reed3. Steffi, where can everybody find you?
You can find me on Twitter at SteffiDeem or on Instagram at Starshippin'.
And Jason, where can everybody find what you're doing?
You can find me at Twitter at OregonJM.
Follow the show on Twitter at ScienceNight1 and visit our website, scinight.com, for links to all our other social media. past episodes, links to the stories we talk about and the people we talk to, and our merch.
Merchandising.
That's right.
9 Inch Snails is a hit.
It is. Everyone's talking about it. All of Gen Con was up in arms about these 9 Inch Snails t-shirts. So why don't you go and buy one now before we have to shut it down because it's just too popular? We'll be back in 1 week with another special episode. And until then, have a great night. The Science Night Podcast is a proud member of the Riverpower Podcast Mill. To find out more about our shows, go to riverpower.xyz.
Also, something you should know is that for whatever reason, my Audacity is no longer recording my microphone. It is just frozen.
Oh, no.
So we didn't even
we
get that?
We didn't get that song?